Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the transmission. You can donate through the website or become a paid subscriber on the Substack. I do a weekly analysis and also organize off-the-record calls with supporters only, where we discuss what's going on in the world. You can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about whatever you like, expatriation, geopolitics, podcasting. And check out my affiliates and leave a podcast review for Geopolitics and Empire. Joining us for the first time today to talk population control and eugenics is Margaret Sutherland, who was born in Singapore, was raised in Malaysia, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Australia, and North Yorkshire. And the chance discovery of a suitcase of papers in a cellar in Britain in December 2013 led to his book, Exterminating Poverty, the True Story of the Eugenic Plan to Get Rid of the Poor, and the Scottish doctor who opposed it, which we'll be discussing. His links are in the description, HallidaySutherland.com, as well as ExterminatingPovertyBook.com. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you very much, Hervé, and thank you so much for having me and for your interest in the book.
Thanks. I just finished reading it here, the digital version. Let me throw it up on my Kindle here. People can see it, Exterminating Poverty. And yeah, anything you want to add about yourself, as well as why you wrote the book?
Well, I'll go straight to the why I wrote the book. I wrote the book. I was born in 1960, about 6 months after my grandfather, Dr. Halliday Sutherland, died. And he's relevant because he's the Scottish doctor who fought against eugenics. And I was named Halliday in his memory. Now, growing up, I became aware that he was involved in a big court case against Dr. Marie Stopes. And for those who don't know her, she's Britain's Margaret Sanger, operating at around the same time. And she is a saint of contraception, women's rights, reproductive rights, and stuff like that. So when I actually went and I looked for information about the case, I looked in the biographies of Stopes, and they were told me basically that Dr. Sutherland attacked her because he was a Roman Catholic doctor. And at that stage, doctors, if you wanted contraceptives at that stage, the doctor would be the person that you would go to, or what they called rubber shops or whatever like that. But they were not given out in family planning clinics because they didn't exist. So there was that. So the other reason why he attacked her, they said, was he was a Roman Catholic. And Roman Catholic teachings prohibits the use of artificial contraception, artificial devices. And so that was enough for them. They said, well, that's why he attacked her. And so for many years, I believed that. No one, family, friends, or otherwise, told me differently. And then when I looked into it, including some of the documents I found in the suitcase, I realized there was a very, very different story. And I think it needed to be told because the Catholics Against Contraceptive schema was so powerful. It was the accepted version of the case, not just for the people who are interested in such things, but even my family used to believe it. And that's why I thought that the record had to be set straight. Almost there. What I then did was I would write to biographers or people who would write articles online, and I'd say, look, that's great. Read your article. I found it of great interest. And by the way, I'd always be polite because I didn't want them to give them an excuse to tell me to go away. But I said, look, do you realize there's another side of the story? And I would proffer that story with evidence, with citations. Sometimes I would send people documents, or I'd try and get them to correct their articles. And most of the time, with very rare exceptions, they would just ignore me completely. And that's when I realized that they were not so much, I believe, interested in correct history or interesting history. I believe at that stage, they were interested in perpetuating a triumphalist story where they can knock down Dr. Sutherland as this horrible Catholic, zealous patriarch who's trying to chain women to the kitchen sink. And as I hope will explain, it wasn't like that at all. And that's why I thought the story had to be told.
And so, Marie Stopes, the British Margaret Sanger, as you say. And I just, again, brings me back one of my memories when I decided to study, in the U.S. You basically follow the rest of the sheep. You do what you're told. You go to high school. You got to go to university, right? And so I'm like, when I decided to study my bachelor's, I'm like, well, I don't know what do I like? History. History is my favorite thing. I guess I'll study history. What can you do with history? Become a teacher, become a journalist, whatever. I guess now become a podcaster many years later. And so I studied history. And in one of my history classes in Illinois, they brought up Margaret Sanger. We all had to write a paper on something, an 8-page paper. And I don't remember if I was assigned it or I chose that as one of the topics, but I wrote an 8-page paper on Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood. And I wrote it at that time. I was being indoctrinated through this liberal worldview. And I wrote this paper detailing Margaret Sanger in a positive light. And it wasn't until years later where I realized, I've got a full 180 degree on Margaret Sanger, everything she stood for. She was racist, eugenics, all this sort of stuff. So I thought I'd bring that up. And I hadn't been aware that Marie Stopes was like the British equivalent of that. And so I don't know where you'd like to start, because one of the core arguments, one of the reasons that your grandfather, Halliday, fought against it was, I think the core of it was eugenics, right? And as he called it, Neo-Malthusianism.
That's correct. That's correct. He started on that journey. He went to Edinburgh University, graduated as MD in 1906, did very, very well there. And he decided at that stage to become involved in the fight against tuberculosis. And as I say in the book, TB was a huge problem at that stage. It killed 70,000 people every year out of a population of about 40 million in Britain. And of that 70,000 deaths, 50,000 was from tuberculosis of the lungs. And they called it consumption, because when you get TB of the lungs, you get a cough, and then it gets worse, you cough up blood. And you become very, very sallow and weak, and you have this horrible putrefying smell. And basically, the body looks like it's consuming you from within. So he became involved in that. I should say, too, that tuberculosis disabled 150,000 people every year. And when the breadwinner of the family became disabled, the whole family would be thrown into destitution. At that stage, the way tuberculosis was taught was that it was primarily an hereditary disease. And so you have a chap called John Berry Haycraft, who gave the Milroy lectures at the end of the 1800s, called Darwinism and Race Progress. And he says, look, it's a tough thing to say, but tuberculosis is a friend of the race because it kills only the feeble. And then if you look, so he wasn't actually trying to be nasty. He just said, look, this is the fact of life. And these people die out so that they don't reproduce. So, yeah, it is a bit. Dr. Sutherland, 1906, graduated around 1910. He goes to the St. Marylebone dispensary for the prevention of consumption, just up by Regent's Park in London. And he starts to get really, really involved. So he's a protege of one of the leading experts called Sir Robert Phillip, and starts implementing his schemes and a few of his own. He makes Britain's first public health cinema film. And if anybody's interested in looking at that, they can go on to the British Film Institute's website. And if they look up the story of John McNeill, McNeill spelt M''Niel, and they'll find that film there. Type in Halliday Sutherland, they'll find the film. They can watch that. Anyway, he then also opens a bandstand, a school and a bandstand in Regent's Park for pre-tuberculous children. And, well, they'll ask you, hey, Ove, did you have a cold classroom when you were a child? You know, the teacher, and you're all sleepy, and the teacher throws open the windows and you all freeze.
I think maybe in Croatia when I went to high school, we had moments like that, yeah.
Well, as you saw in the book, if you're in a class in a bandstand, there are no windows. There are very, very large spaces, and so it would have been freezing cold. However, the children actually got better rather than got worse. So that was quite remarkable there. Anyway, so Sutherland's really, really involved in that. Now, at that stage, for the purposes of the Catholics against contraceptive schema, for the purpose of that, I should point out, he was baptized a Presbyterian, but by the time he'd left university, he's agnostic, he's an atheist in practice, and he's really not that interested in religious matters, apart from to disprove it, really. So then what we do is so you have this big disease and doctors are doing it. Now, at some stage during his work, and he's doing a lot of statistical work, he's going, hang on, I believe that actually I've changed my mind about it, about TB. I used to think it was inherited primarily. I now think it's primarily infectious. So let's go to the eugenics part, the Darwinist part. A Darwinist eugenicist, mainstream eugenicist, would say, no. We know that TB is caused by germs, but the people who get TB are the weak and the feeble, and the people with round shoulders and very narrow lungs. That's the people who get it. So sure, germs are involved, that's great, but it's primarily an hereditary disease. Dr. Sutherland in 1912, he goes in the British Medical Journal and writes an article, and he says, no, it's the other way around. And what he does is he explains how the eugenicists got their statistics wrong. So a eugenicist, what they did back then is they used a lot of statistics. So the founder of eugenics in its modern form, Sir Francis Galton, was a great mathematician. His protege, Karl Pearson, the first professor of eugenics at London University, developed it even further. And so it was all mathematics. So what they'd do is they'd look at people and they'd measure heads and arms and eye color and all these things. And then they would see the correlation between, how it was passed through the different generations. And from that, they were able to say, they thought, that, so much of it is from heredity and so much of it is from somebody's environment. Now, with tuberculosis, what they did was they said, if you have a man and a woman, so I'd like you to imagine now you've got a 4 and a dice, so 2 up, 2 down, and you have the family of 1 man, 1 woman, and then 2 children. Pearson would look at that and he'd say, okay, the man and the woman are not allowed to be closer than first cousins by law. So they're not going to have any heredity in common, in theory, or if it was accidentally. The children, on the other hand, are getting genes from both the mother and the father. So you'd expect that if tuberculosis was an infectious disease, that the husband, let's say the mother has it, the husband as well as the children are going to be likely to get the germs and it spreads that way. Well, actually, no, it turned out the correlation was actually with the children, that if the mother was sick, the husband wouldn't get sick, but the children would. And so Pearson goes, well, that proves it. That proves that it's actually a hereditary condition. And what Dr. Sutherland did in 1912 was he said, look, I understand why you thought that. But the fact of the matter is, the reason is that the children are close to the mother. They don't have fully developed immune systems, and they are constantly being bombarded with infectious disease when the mother sneezes, when she touches their utensils, when she kisses them. And he said, if you've got an infective tea consumption patient in the house, that's why they're going to get it. So I understand why you think, but it's not. It's primarily infectious, not heredity. And that leads to the source of being able to cure the disease, he said.
And just, before getting into then Stopes and Sutherland, just further thoughts on, we'll talk later about eugenics today, but back then, this movement, it's like kind of what you're saying. They were trying to fix instead of laying the facts out and then making policy. They had a policy in mind and wanted to fix the facts around it to achieve this goal, this ideology of this. It was racist, it was eugenics, it was elitist, and so just before getting into the case of Stopes and Sutherland, just other thoughts on this Malthusian, Neo-Malthusian movement that was at the core kind of what was driving Stopes and the rest of her contemporaries.
Yeah, great question. Malthusianism was an older idea. Late 1700s, T.R. Malthus, Reverend T.R. Malthus, writes his theory of population, and effectively he points out the view that as the population increases, food and other resources aren't able to keep up. Therefore, people are competing for resources, and it ends with war, pestilence, and famine. Malthus's ideas influenced Charles Darwin when he wrote Of Origin of Species, and Charles Darwin's ideas influenced the ideas of his cousin, Francis Galton, who was the creator of eugenics in its modern form. And effectively what you've got with Malthus is, he says, look, to prevent this from happening, to prevent the Malthusian crisis from happening, which is we run out of food, everybody's fighting, and we're just dropping dead of plague, there are two checks for that. One is abstinence from sex. The second is vice, and they happen before. Once you go beyond the line of the Malthusian catastrophe, that's the catastrophe happens. These two things can prevent it. Malthus, as a cleric, says, okay, we're going to abstain from sex. He then talks about vice, and he says, look, I don't think it's a good thing, and I wouldn't condone this. However, if somebody's having an affair, if a man's having an affair, and obviously they don't want the products of the what's going on there, then they're going to use contraceptives. And he said, even though I don't approve of that, that's a better outcome than actually going to the fully fledged Malthusian catastrophe. And it was a very, very influential idea. And so, for example, during the Irish famines of 1845 to 52, British Malthusians were saying, well, the Irish, they have such large families. Of course, Malthusian crisis. And they just, and actually, you still get people who today, they talk about the Irish potato famine. And it's quite insulting, really, because sure, their potatoes had the blight and they didn't have enough potatoes, but there was other food in Ireland. But the trouble is, what it was all happening was you had absentee landlords in Ireland who were in hock to the London bankers, and they had to pay their debts. And so when people were actually dying of starvation, they were still exporting all the farm produce that could have saved the Irish. They were still exporting it to Britain. And so it's not just an idea of, that makes sense, but it's actually an idea that really has a powerful hold. And also what it does is it blames the poor for their poverty. And so when Dr. Sutherland's talking against Malthusian at one stage, he wrote a leaflet, and it was called, Do Babies Build Slums? And what he would do is he would argue, no, babies, they don't have agency to build the slums. They're born into the slum. And if you're going to cite, Thomas Malthus, what a great idea this fellow had, you've got to remember he said that there's enough greed and stupidity and incompetence and so on to cause the poverty that you see in Britain before you come to his scientific theory. Anyway, so Malthus said people should abstain from sex and that would work. And a lot of people, you can understand, would say, well, that's not going to work. And so you had this group called the Neo-Malthusians, and the Neo-Malthusians were the people who would use contraceptives. And sometimes contraceptives were known as Malthusian devices, and then they would promote those. And background to, in between around 1800 to 1900, Britain's population doubled. So there's huge increase in population. And what you had was, you had this thing which the eugenicists worried about, and it was called the differential birth rate. And what that was that from around the mid-1880s onwards, the birth rate peaked and then it began to fall, and it continually fell from then on. And no one really knew the reason for the fall. Was it because of the influence of the Neo-Malthusians? It might have been. There was a big case, I think, in the 1880s where Charles Bradlaugh and Annie Besant were put on this enormous trial for publishing a book called The Fruits of Philosophy, which was actually promulgating Malthusian ideas and contraception. So no one really knew why the population was dropping. Now, the thing is this as well, is that the drop in the population was not evenly represented across all classes of society. And so while middle class, upper class people were, generally speaking, having fewer children, the poor and working class people were not. And, as I understand it, families of 9, 10, 11, 12, with a number of stillbirths, babies born dead, etc., like that, were not uncommon. And this caused the Malthusians, Neo-Malthusians, and the eugenicists to absolutely really panic. Because what they said is, if you have let's use the example of a livestock farm. You got horses, pigs, cattle, whatever you like, and you're running a livestock farm. If you actually start breeding from the worst stocks, you're going to go out of business pretty quickly. Okay? Well, what they said is, here we're dealing with the British Empire. And here you're seeing a birth rate falling, so we're not going to be able to populate as much as we were previously. But if you look at the people who are going to populate the next generation, the lowest quarter of society are producing over 1/2 of the next generation. And they said, basically, do a few iterations of that, and you're going to collapse. And they spoke about race degeneration and even race suicide because of this differential birth rate. So they really, really were worried about it. Anyway, so that's I hope I've answered the question. I've rambled a bit, but just give you an idea of these ideas really aren't just sort of little esoteric thing that academics dream up. They are important and they have consequences.
And I think this is a core subject that's important for me when it comes to geopolitics and empire, because this ideology is still here today. It's going strong. It's affecting many of the policies being implemented against us today. And it's true, that way of viewing the world, because I view all humans as on the level. And I've spent time, as you have, in foreign countries, in third world countries, and I've met the poor and the meek. I've been around the rich, and you meet great people on both sides, right? You meet many poor people that are healthy, that are great. You meet some that are not nice people, but I can say this: I've met rich people that I wouldn't want to be friends with, and so there's that. And then you mentioned in your book, I think that's when they were discussing that population decline that we're seeing today in just in general in the world, in the Western world, it could have been affected with these policies from a century ago. And then you also mentioned in your book at one point, quote, it's written, the significance of Stopes' clinic was not the introduction of contraceptives, which had, after all, been in use for many years, but her racial and social aims for the C3s. And I found this language in general was interesting, where she was using this language of like A1 for the like they're referring to us as animals. And even today, the way that they refer to us in these government policies related to the pandemic, the health policies, the green agendas, it's like, they're treating us like cattle. They want to tag us like cattle. And so back then they're referring to like C-level, humans and A-level humans. And just so, if you want to tell us then how the story began with Stopes, and then your grandfather Halliday, who wrote a book where there was a few things I think that were blown way out of context, and then when Stopes went after him, yeah.
Well, actually, can I tell you about the C3s and the A1s and all of that? That was when the army had recruitment offices in Britain's industrial cities to get the loyal subjects to go and fight the Boer War, and also fight in the First World War. What happened was a number of people were turned away. So there was either it was a rumor or it was true that 60% of people, poor and working class people, were turned away from a recruitment office in Manchester as unfit to serve on mental and physical grounds. And so these recruiting offices really, really revealed the absolutely appalling state of the poor in those cities. There was malnourishment, there was, huge pollution, there were appalling working and living conditions. And this really brought it to the fore when they turned up to fight and they had to be turned away. And the idea of the A1 and the C3, that's when those terms actually entered the lexicon. And people still use A1 today, not so much C3s. But effectively what those terms refer to is A, B, and C refers to the quality of the soldier or the potential recruit you have in front of you. And the A can serve anywhere in the British Empire, can go and impose. I mean, I grew up in a number of the countries, for that reason as a British person, and they would go and serve anywhere in the empire in a frontline role. When you get down to the Bs, not so much, maybe, an administrative role or a home duties role, never to be seen in the empire. And then the 1, 2, and 3 was the condition of the person, 1 being the healthiest, C3s. Now, the C3s were the worst, and they got rejected. And that's when those terms became really, really widespread at that time.
Yeah. From the administrative perspective, makes total sense. But then it being used in the wider sense, for me, I think as Stopes was to then prevent people from. I mean, this then gets into what the book mentions, forced sterilization, right, and preventing people who otherwise might be fine in having kids. Like you're now taking the choice away from men and women, and we've seen modern cases. Again, people can research in the 90s, I think, in Peru, the WHO sterilized 100,000 Peruvian women without them knowing, and you can wager that most of these women were fine to have children. And it was a Catholic, I think, NGO that discovered this, and so they were putting some sterilants into the injection to sterilize these women in Peru. But anyways, I guess do we then go on to Marie Stopes and her setting up her clinic and her different forms of what she was promoting, books and pamphlets of these ideas. First of all, these ideas she was trying to feed into the public, and then the contratemps. I think it was the golden pin, and things like this. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. We mentioned about Dr. Sutherland 1910 being at that clinic in St. Marylebone. By 1917, midst the First World War, he makes a speech, Consumption, Its Cause and Cure, in which he says, look, we can cure TB, we can prevent it, but there's some people stopping it, and they're the eugenicists. He accused them of having race breeder. They accused them of being race breeders with the souls of cattle breeders. And he said, look, if we're treating people with tuberculosis, the tuberculous poor, we're not preserving the feeble ones who should die. He said they're already dead. The ones we are doing is we're conserving the strong. And that's what we need to do. We need to conserve the strong. A year after that, you have Sir James Barr, who's the ex-president of the British Medical Association. He makes a speech on the future of the medical profession. And in that speech, he talks about tuberculosis as doing a rough but effective job in killing off the feeble. And I don't know if I mentioned, but tuberculosis was a disease of poverty, which affected the poor around 3 to 4 times more than it did the wealthier people. So he's saying, look, it's doing such a good, rough and effective job of killing off the feeble, we're not ready for its disappearance. And then if he said, and this direct quote, he said that if tuberculosis was to disappear, it would be, quote, nothing short of a national calamity, close quotes. And so basically, he's got his lethal device, as it were. He doesn't have to arrange for people to be strapped down to gurneys and given an injection, because he's got a legal disease, which you can see he's not going to be going out to prevent everybody. Okay, now get on to your question. Stopes opens her clinic the 17th of March, 1921, in a poor part of London. Sir James Barr is looking for the prevention of the marriage of undesirables, as he puts it. When Stopes opens her clinic, he realizes, yep, that's great. This is the person we've been looking for. And I'm just actually looking for the quote. That's why I'm looking down. So Barr writes to, he's asked to speak at a rally she holds in the Queen's Hall, but he can't make it. He's in Paris. But he writes her a letter, and she publishes this letter in the book of the speeches at the rally. So not only is this his view, but she's pleased that it is his view and wants to tell the world, look at this great man who's following me. But what he said was, he wrote, Dear Dr. Marie Stopes, I am exceedingly sorry I shall not be able to attend your great meeting on May the 31st, which I hope will prove historical. You and your husband have inaugurated a great movement, which I hope will eventually get rid of our C3 population and exterminate poverty. The only way to raise an A1 population is to breed them. With the best wishes for the success of your movement, I am yours very sincerely, James Barr. He didn't just write the letter. When she set up her clinic, he actually joined the society which backed the clinic, and that was the Society for Constructive Birth Control and Racial Progress. So he joined as a vice president, and along with a number of eminent people, names that are still known today, such as John Maynard Keynes, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, and other people who were as eminent but aren't as well known today. So then when the court case between Dr. Sutherland and Stopes occurs in February 1923, Barr testifies for Stopes on the second day of the trial for her and against Sutherland. So he was very, very involved. So she's got the backing of this one eugenicist and others, I would argue, because you can read their writings. But the thing is that Stopes' clinic was a eugenic plan. The brand names which she chose, her brand names that she used in her clinic, the cervical caps, the brand names were racial brand and pro-race brand. Now, today when we think of racism, we think of skin color racism. Back then, it wasn't so much skin color, because there was a lot of racism between Scots and Irish and Welsh and everything like that. And it was as nasty. It really was as nasty. And so the names of her contraceptives proved that. She says in her manifesto, the so-called tenets of the CBC, she says, look, we are a pro-baby organization, but we are as much about preventing people who are unsuited for parenthood from breeding as it is from bringing healthy babies into the world. The logo of the clinic, or the scent of the clinic, is a joyous and deliberate motherhood, a sure light in our racial darkness, and babies in the right place. So it was very much on the base of class-based eugenics. And you could go on. There are her pronouncements. Now, I said that the manifesto said that it said, well, people who are unsuited for parenthood. Why would they be unsuited? Well, she specified, because they had racial diseases. What's a racial disease? Tuberculosis. And so if you're the tuberculous poor, you're not allowed to breed. And other conditions she didn't like. And the language she used was utterly appalling. She always maintained that she was a scientist, a doctor of science. But the thing is that more than that, she described them as the spawn of drunkards, parasites, undesirables, and other horrible names. And so not just is she eugenist, but she's actually whipping up the real othering and hatred of that other to push through an agenda to get rid of them. The other thing as well is that while she opened her clinic with those aims in place, she was lobbying politicians, including she sent a copy of her book, Radiant Motherhood, which recommended that the parasites, both men and the women, be dealt with at a few simple acts of parliament, as she put it, for their compulsory sterilization through x-rays. And so, when I looked into it to begin with, and I was learning what a terrible fellow my grandfather was for stopping this woman who was trying to give women reproductive choice in a time when they had families, 10, 11, 12 children. I didn't know about the eugenics bit. And then when you learn, she gave her women choice, you say, well, hang on. If the choice she wanted to came about, if that legislation had been passed, that choice would have been made by a state official, not by the woman or the husband or the man. It would have been made by the state official of saying, well, you're not having children. That's our decision. And so it was just a complete misrepresentation and absolutely, very much a eugenic project. Dr. Sutherland got into trouble with Stopes because he wrote a book. It was called, in 1922, he published a book, and it was called Birth Control, a statement of Christian doctrine against the Neo-Malthusians. And in the book, under the heading Exposing the Poor to Experiment, he refers to a woman, a doctor of German science, who has opened this clinic in a poor part of London, and she's giving out contraceptives, which has been described by the lady who's the head of gynecology at London University as the worst, the most dangerous technique you could use. So those are the libelous words, and then March or May 1922, he gets a writ for libel from Stopes. In the biographies of Stopes, her biographers are always very keen to quote those words and say, what a terrible thing to say, what a completely over-the-top attack. They never quote the paragraph that follows in his book, in which he says that if you proliferate your contraceptives, and if the poor are forbidden to have children, and having the poor is the privilege of the rich, he said the women of the poor who currently work very, very hard for their families will be forced to go out and work, and they will be subject to the exploitation, employment exploitation, that particularly he said, in the lower grades of work. And he said, look, if this comes around, he said that the poor have lost their homes with the farm enclosures, the farming agricultural revolution in the 1700s and 1800s. They've lost their home. And he said that if this comes about, they will have now lost their hearth as well. They won't, and he said it will turn Britain into a slave state. He said he used the term servile state, which he got from his colleague and acquaintance Hilaire Belloc. And basically it's a country in which those without capital have to go out and work. They have no societal will. They can't create families. And basically they just work so that they are permitted to survive and eat food and go to work, and that's it. And when I read that, I did get shivers down I thought, hang on, I've studied this for some time. And those biographers, none of them ever mentioned that. They must have known that was the case. They must have seen the nasty language, but they kept on insisting in turning it into, a go-girl feminist, give woman reproductive choice against a nasty, backward-looking Catholic patriarch. And so I was quite startled by that, because you may not agree with his views on abortion, contraceptives. That doesn't matter. But you can see that he wasn't all bad, and you're reading a more interesting historical story. And that's why it surprised me so much that they ignored me when I got in touch with them. Thought, you guys are just proliferating a triumphal story rather than actually genuinely being interested in the truth. And I still hold that view, actually, because what I find now is, I go and write the book to sort of attack this position and expect debate or pushback. They've just melted away. It's like you charge up the hill to attack the opposition, and you find the trenches are empty, and you find that they thought, yeah, you're right. We'll give this one, and we're not going to debate it with you because it'll save us embarrassment, and it'll save us the problem
And
having to defend it.
And what you said about the slave society, though, I think that's important, because you see it in all the science fiction dystopia literature, in the movies, and I think today, this is what the rulers of the planet actually want to bring about. And we see it through these ideas of feminism that proliferate, the contraception. I interviewed Mary Harrington years ago, who she talks about cyborg theocracy and transhumanism, and that actually, one of the first steps towards where we are going now, towards merging man with machine, becoming post-human, was contraception, because you're modifying your body. We're beginning all these processes of modifying our bodies like cyborgs, and basically you read Aldous Huxley and all these books that they want to create this slave society, and it's like, I think even still today that thought is with the elite, because they don't want us having children or families, because, as you mentioned, that's the net. That's where sovereignty and agency are. If something happens, you fall back on a husband or a wife or a child or an uncle or a grandpa. And if you don't have any of that, you're just this worker bee that's disposable. And I feel like that's kind of what they want, that ideology, the elite. They'll have families, but not for us. We are just meant to be the worker bees that are disposable in this gig economy. And something, the quote from Jesus came to me from the Bible that said, the poor will always be with you. So this idea that they're trying to constantly eradicate the poor, you can eradicate them, but I mean, they're always going to be here. I think from the beginning until the end of time. So trying to eradicate them is not the way to go about it. And what else was I going to add from my notes? One thing that I thought was interesting, you mentioned in your book that Stopes claims that God spoke to her. Like, literally, she's saying, I was in the forest and God spoke to me. I'm a prophet. And she, if you want to touch on that incident.
Yes, she was in her garden near Leatherhead in Surrey, about an hour out of London. Be very nice. And she saw these yew trees, and she went, and the Almighty spoke to her. So she rushes inside and she dictates. Now, God is perfect. And so, as one would expect, the timing of him dictated this message to Stopes is just in time for the meeting. I forget the name. Is it the synod or the conference of all the bishops from the Anglican Church? And Stopes writes this pamphlet and sends one to each delegate attending. And she goes, "My lords," she addressed the bishops, "my lords, you are God's bishops. I am his prophet. This is what you need to do." And she comes out with this screed. And it's quite an absurd thing. And it's quite funny. I'm laughing because, the sort of biographers hugely embarrassed by this. They really, really play it down. Because, if you're going to make Dr. Sutherland out to be the religious nut, well, actually, maybe you should look at your own person. But it was quite funny in the court case. Dr. Sutherland's barrister, he cross-examined her on this. Do you believe you're the prophet of God? And she said, well, I wrote what he told me to write. And he said, don't you think there's a really, really close link between God's speaking style and your writing style? I mean, they're identical. And he's obviously taken the mickey out of that. So it's very funny. But having said that, obviously Malthus was a cleric. But yeah, when you get to Sir Francis Galton, when he coined eugenics I think it was around 1903, and he defined, that eugenics was the human direction of evolution. So humans are going to direct it rather than survival of the fittest. Actually, we're going to take over and do a better job than God did. So there's always that materialistic, what we'd call a technocratic thing now of, God, yeah, thanks, you've helped us for so long, but, can you step aside because we're going to take over? But Galton wrote this book called Can't Say Where. And in his book, he indicates that he sees that the national religion of Britain becomes eugenics. And there's this sort of council of elders, and the sort of religion they worship is the race, and the council of elders decide to whom money is going to be given, so that, the better specimens are given money. And it's like a completely, it would be a completely ghastly religion to go and attend services for, sort of, don't you sit there, Solomon, you're a bit tubby. Let that sort of very tall, good-looking family, you go and sit at the back or something like that. So there's a sort of quite a strong link between religion and these people. Now, my co-author, Neil Sutherland, my brother, he thinks that Stopes was, as the Cockneys say, that she was taking the Mickey Bliss. And she thought, well, if the Catholics can sort of invoke God, well, I'm going to do even better in spades. But certainly, yeah, she made that a big thing, and it was quite funny.
Yeah, it says in your book, it was printed in A New Gospel to All Peoples, a revelation of God uniting physiology and the religions of man. So I think it's crazy. And then, a good portion of your book, the bulk of it, deals with the court case. And it was interesting to read because you don't usually read books in this manner. And, reading sections of the court transcript or case from a century ago, but, it's all still relevant today, and whatever you think is important regarding the case, they go to court, and then the verdict comes about. There's an appeal. What do you think is key here?
I think the thing that's key is that it was a very bitterly fought case. And it came at a pivotal moment where you've got the Malthusians and the eugenicists gaining the upper hand and implementing their programs. And you've got people opposing them. And it's a pivotal moment because these two movements clash, and they have the court case by which to clash. So both of them bring the experts from both sides, and both of them, under oath in court, say what they're trying to do. Stopes says, Stopes' barrister, Sir Patrick Hastings, presents her as this kindly woman who's helping her poorer sisters, who's been very unreasonably attacked in this book. It then comes out when she testifies on day 3, why she did it, which she said, look, I wanted to end the social evil of the reproduction and of the wrong end of society and the reduction at the right end of society. So that was the pivotal time. It also revealed the reasons people were going to do it, both in the correspondence leading up to the case, and also what they stated in the case. But you mentioned about the gold pin or the gold spring earlier, and that really showed the lengths to which she was prepared to go to actually implement this. The gold spring or gold pin was a device. It's possibly an early form of the IUD, and effectively what it does is it inserts these wire prongs into the uterus and holds the uterus open. And Sutherland and his barristers brought this into the case because they were asserting that she was experimenting on the poor. And the gold pin was, they said, an experiment because they didn't know what it did. Some experts said, well, if you hold open the uterus, what you'll do is you'll facilitate the passage of sperm to enhance conception. Therefore, it'll enhance conception. Other people said, well, yeah, but if conception takes, the fact that there's a foreign body in place, it's going to get in the way, so it's going to actually be a contraceptive. And yet a third person, and this came out well in the court, said, no, that's neither of those two are right. If it's left in place, because the uterus wants to close, the womb wants to close to get on with generating the new life that's been born, it's actually going to produce an abortion, probably a septic abortion, and leaving this device in women over a period of times. There was a case brought up in the trial of a woman who actually had one embedded into her flesh. And, basically they had to sort of cut it out and remove it and then sterilize it. And, the expert, the doctor said, look, she was very lucky to get away with her life. Because the fact of the matter is, this is in the days before antibiotics. And if you're doing stuff like that. Now, Stopes countered and said, well, I never handed out the gold pin at my clinic. And so they said, well, we disagree. And so the dispute was, if you turned up, you wouldn't get the gold pin. However, what she did was she would pass patients to Dr. Jane Hawthorne, and Dr. Jane Hawthorne had knowledge of the gold pin or gold spring and how to fit it and what she didn't like about it. Also, what was read out in court was a letter from Stopes to Dr. Norman Hare saying, these two women have written to me and I'm going to send them to you to be fitted with the gold pin. And he wrote back to her and said, absolutely not. This thing is an abortifacient. And if I implant it, I could be struck off or worse. So I'm not going to put it. And so Germaine Greer, you know about Germaine Greer, very famous Australian/British feminist. And so, and I mention her name because she said that Stopes's advocacy of the gold spring just showed how much she cared about poor and working class people and how little regard she had for them, and applying standards of care that were a lot less than the medical profession that she attacked so much. And I'm mentioning the Germaine Greer because you would expect her, through ideology, through where she starts, to be more on the side of Stopes. So for her to say it, it really does really make the point that she was, as the defense asserted, experimenting on the poor.
Again, when you mention that, I think, one of the greatest joys that anyone, but, also the poor, that they can have is having their own children. And it's just like,
yes.
to deny that. I recently had Barbara Demick on. She talked about the one-child policy in China, which was a crazy book, insane book. And just a few decades ago, what the Chinese were having to deal with, this type of stuff. I mean, that's kind of, it's all related now that you think about it. What was going on out in Britain, in Europe, and then in China, they were forcing abortions, sometimes killing the parents, kidnapping the children, and then that was the basis for the rural economy as well, to have children, because it's part of it's one way to get out of poverty as well, to have more children, if you look at it that way. And then in the court case, you end up having, initially, I think he was looking for Sutherland. You needed money to defend yourself. I think it was difficult to get support. I think a cardinal initially gave him some money, and then the verdict ended up being mixed, and then he lost on the appeal. And I kind of found it sad that the Catholic. I would have thought the Catholic Church should just give him the money that he needed to pay the damages, but just the thoughts on the verdict. I thought it was kind of okay that it came out mixed initially, and he was going to pay what, £100, but then she won at the appeal.
He won the initial trial at the High Court, and the verdict wasn't mixed. So what you had, I mean, it was, but it wasn't. So that doesn't make any sense. I'll explain what I mean. There were 4 questions put to the jury. First one is, are the words that he wrote defamatory? In other words, would they make, if you read the words, would you think less of them? And the jury came back and said yes. The second question was, are they true in substance and in fact? And so, if you say something about somebody and it's true, they shouldn't be allowed. Like if I, say somebody's the worst crook in London, they shouldn't be able to say, I'm suing you for that. And even though they are the worst crook in London, then they shouldn't be able to get damages from me from that. So truth is a defense. And the jury said, are the words true in substance fact? They said yes. The third question was, are they fair comment? And the idea of fair comment is that if somebody's doing something as a private citizen, and then I get on the front page of a national newspaper and I'll go, oh, this person's a terrible person, and I defame them, they'll say, well, that wasn't really fair. If, on the other hand, they're a public figure and they're doing something politically that is of public interest, then I've got more leeway. So the question was the remarks fair comment. They said no. And then it said damages, if any, £100. Now, the defense then stand up and they say, as you say, mixed verdict. It was quite obvious that it was defamatory. Even though we fell down, the truth defense worked. We win because of number 3. But what the defense successfully argued, and they successfully argued this because Stopes's barrister, one of them, Sir Hugh Fraser, was an expert on the law of libel, and he had to agree with it. Why? Because he wrote the book. And the thing is, they said, look, the precedent is as soon as truth has been proven, that's the end of the matter. And so questions 3 and 4 are irrelevant. And so it came down to an illegal argument. And, if you want Sutherland to win, you say, oh, you won the legal argument. And if you don't want to win, you sort of go, oh, they won on a technicality. Well, that technicality is called the law. So anyway, so what she did was, as you say, she went to the Court of Appeal. She sent her solicitor to go to the judge's clerks and to find out if any of the appeal judges were Catholics. She absolutely hated Catholics, and she when she died, her son destroyed a lot of her papers about her anti-Catholic campaigns, and I'd love to have seen it, because when you see the papers, that's a surprise, they were quite unhinged. Anyway, so she goes to the Court of Appeal. None of the appeal judges are Catholics, and she wins. So far, what's the score? High Court, that's 1 judgment to Sutherland. Court of Appeal, judgment to Stopes, and that's a 2-1 verdict. So you've got 2 judges for Sutherland, 2 for Stopes. It then, in November 1924, Sutherland counter-appeals to the House of Lords. 5 judges look at it. 4 judges go Sutherland's way, 1 judge dissents. And so that makes it a 6-2, if you like, although it's not counted that way. So yeah, it was very, very bitterly fought. Both of them, I think, were absolutely drained by the trial. Sutherland actually was quite sick with a heart affliction afterwards as well. But yeah, it was very, very bitterly fought.
Mentioned, I think, myocarditis, no?
Something like that, yeah.
And this was before COVID. And then later you mentioned that he wrote some best-selling books that were translated into many languages, yeah?
That's correct. And he was always an author. There was a story when he was a schoolboy, he wrote an article for the local press in Glasgow on the rules of rugby union. Anyway, the next day, he goes to the schoolmate to the press office, goes to the reception and says, I've come to collect my 10 shillings for writing the article. So somebody goes through to see the editor and says, there's a guy. And, so the editor is apparently quite indignant. And he goes, this guy's an idiot. Doesn't he know that we'd take 10 days to pay? And then when he walks out and he sees there's a 14-year-old schoolboy who wrote the article, he was so impressed he paid him on the spot. But anyway, Halliday always had the gift of writing, and he also had the gift of observing people, really interested in humans. And in 1933, he wrote his autobiography, The Archers of the Years, and you can pick up copies cheaply today online, a couple of pounds. And it's his sort of biography of his life and adventures in Scotland and around the world. It made the Publishers Weekly list of bestsellers for 1933, and that really put him on the map as an author and writer, public speaker, and so on. I'd also point out that in 1933, he also wrote a story called The Perfect Eugenic State. And in this story, it's a sort of science fiction where there's a Winston Smith. Now, I don't know, he beat Orwell to do it. He wrote it in 33, not in 48. And calling somebody Winston Smith, well, Winston and Smith are pretty common names, I guess. So there you go. But his Winston Smith gets carted off and he goes to the Lethal Institute, where they try and put him to death, and for various reasons, which I won't disclose. But it's a great story. It's on HallidaySutherland.com. You can go and read it. But the thing is that, and other articles make it very, very clear that the opponents of eugenics knew where this was going to end. And that this idea of, the T4 program, where the Nazis sort of gassed disabled people because they were costing too much, did not come as a surprise. Dr. Sutherland was writing about it, referring to it in 1921 and in 1933. And so when it actually occurred, it was like, yep, we saw that coming. It wasn't a great surprise of these people going, oh, never,
Yeah, that recalls, I've had on the program Edwin Black. I haven't fully read his book, but he wrote IBM and the Holocaust, or IBM and I think Holocaust. The other book on eugenics, I have it right behind me. What is this? The title? It's
War on the Weak.
War Against the Weak, and some of the subsequent stuff. I heard him mention that you realize the movement behind the Germans. It was the Anglo-American establishment. So all the same people we're talking about, and I mean, Black's stuff is impeccable. He's got the sources, so you can't argue. And he points out how in the U.S. at this time period with in the 20s and 30s, you had governors of states like in Ohio. I think he had mentioned once that wanted to implement laws to forcibly sterilize people and kill them, like what the Germans did. To take people who were deemed, let's say, C3 or whatever in the U.S. and send them, they were talking about the Ozarks, setting up a concentration camp to then send C3 Americans to be, some options sterilized, but others to be exterminated in the U.S. And then, in England, the British Empire, and then the Germans. And so, Hitler, he talks about that. The policies were coming from, Rockefeller, all these elite oligarchic clans, Rockefeller, Carnegie, probably, Ford, and then the financing that was backing that. And then he talks about today, maybe we can get your thoughts to where we are at today. Edwin Black calls it new eugenics. All this stuff that is coming online. You've got genomics, you've got DNA, all this stuff. You've got this surveillance apparatus coming in. And Edwin Black said that COVID, it was, what did he say? It hyper accelerated, taking us from where we were further on down this road of eugenics and what he calls the algorithm ghetto, what I treat a lot, this sort of panopticon to take from the British, Jeremy Bentham, that they're now trying to impose upon us, and they need our biometrics. I mean, it's basically, they didn't have the technology back then, around what Spokes was, or her time, but where we are today is just the next level. Our eye biometrics, our fingerprints, they want our DNA, right? They want our blood samples for this sort of panopticon system. They want to put us in. Then you've got the green agenda, which, it's about bringing in population control. Before we hit record, you brought up Paul Ehrlich. I've got his book right here, The Population Explosion. And then, Boris Johnson. And you also brought up Stanley Johnson before we hit record. People here's the Telegraph I've got open on my screen, October 2007, an op-ed from Boris Johnson, who says global overpopulation is the real issue. So I'm rambling a bit, but your thoughts on, how this sort of takes us to today.
Well, if I could say that just about Edwin Black's book, I found it interesting because it's so well researched and so well written. But I find it interesting when I read about Stopes. Obviously, I've got skin in the game, because of my family connection. And actually, just on that, as you've seen in my book, there are a lot of citations and references. There are just shy of 700 in 320 pages or so. And I did that because if I read my book, I'd say, well, he's a grandson, he's going to be biased. And so I really held myself to that standard. But when I see people talk about Stopes, I sort of assess, whether I believe what they're saying or not. So, for instance, there's one biographer of Stopes, and she says, yes, she was a eugenist, but she was nice to the women who turned up to her clinic. So she wasn't a very good one. And if she really, really hated the working classes, she would have been really nasty to them. And I thought, that just doesn't hold water, On that basis, you go to a secondhand car yard and, the guy was really nice to me. and so he must be really nice. He's not really a good sort of double-dealing crook selling me a lemon. Sorry, I should apologize to all secondhand car dealers. I just used that. I don't want you to get sued for libel by the... Anyway. But anyway, with Black, when he talks about Sanger, there are parts where he denies her agency. When he sort of says, that while she wasn't... that she invited a whole lot of people to speak at some function or something, and they were all eugenicists. And I thought, well, yeah, because she was too. But there's a part in his conclusion on Sanger, and he said that one of the great tragedies of eugenics was if you had somebody who loved humanity as much as Sanger did, but in doing so could not love all of it. And I thought, well, hang on, humanity is an abstract, and it is all of it. And so if you only love a part of it, you don't really love humanity. And so it was a real sort of pretzel. And so I wouldn't agree with Black there. Though I don't know his motives, but certainly I do know with other biographers and writers and authors, what they're doing is they're writing their histories to frame it a certain way today, so that we can sort of say, the eugenicists of yesteryear, they're all dead, they're all pale, male, and stale, Galton's dead, Pearson's gone, it's all safe, come out now. And it's not, and they're still going. And, you link the past to the present. In 1960, the British Eugenics Society, in the 50s, post-war, its membership had dropped by around one half, and their writing was on the wall. And so they got C.P. Blacker, their secretary, to sort of actually examine what are they going to do about this membership dropping. And one of his recommendations, which was adopted in February 1960, was to adopt a policy of, quote, crypto-eugenics, unquote. That's their word. And obviously that's secret eugenics, which he says is working rather well for the American Eugenics Society. So basically what they're going to do is they're going to do the eugenic program, but they're not really going to disclose. And subsequent to that, you have name changes. You have the Eugenics Review, their monthly journal, or quarterly journal, I should say, and that now becomes the Journal of Biosocial Sciences. Eventually, albeit after a long time, the Eugenics Society changes its name to the Galton Institute. And a couple of years ago, they've changed their name to the Adelphi Genetics Forum. And I'd no doubt in about 3 years' time, there'll be the sort of, the Peckham Indian tandoori restaurant or something, because they try and get away from it. But the fact is, what you do is ideas live on through institutions. They're passed down. And while the people in the Eugenics Adelphi Forum would say, well, we're not like that. We're good people. Go and ask Bertrand Russell. Go and ask Bernard Shaw. Go and ask H.G. Wells. Are they bad people? Go and ask Stopes. They're not going to say they're bad people. Oh, we're good people too. Match. And what they're doing is they're pushing the envelope and stuff. So I'm not saying they're evil, boo, wah, ha, 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 how can we do this? But you don't actually have to be evil. All you have to do is just get a bit hard-hearted and start to see people as amorphous groups rather than individuals, and start to label them the right way. And that's how you can actually end up killing them without feeling bad about it. Sorry, please interrupt if I'm rambling, but, so for instance, the Nazis say they got the idea of, they got the idea, as you say, from the Anglo-American eugenics program, but they also got it from, so authors, apologies for my pronunciation, it's Binding and Hosch, and they wrote a book in the 1920s called On Life Unworthy of Life. And they were Germans, and it was written in German, On Life Unworthy of Life, and it's written by a doctor and by a lawyer saying, is it okay to kill these people? And they came up with the answer, we're pretty much on the one hand, on the other, but go right ahead. And the Nazis looked and thought, yeah, good idea, we'll do that. And they did it. If you go to, I think it was 2012, certainly in the earlier this century, sorry, I skipped a bit, which is that after the war, people point to Binding and Hosch and say, this was your idea, you wrote this book. And they go, hey, what do you know? It was just a thought experiment. 2012, and you can read this article in the British Medical Journal. It's actually available. It's not behind a paywall. And it's called Post-Birth Abortion, Should the Baby Live? And the authors basically go through the ethical justification of if you can terminate the birth before it's born, he or she is born, then there's, pretty much no reason why you shouldn't afterwards. Currently, we call it murder, although it's actually a work in progress. You see some of the cases about the preservation of life, such as the Alfie Evans case, for instance, where that's being, I thought, slowly eroded, probably rapidly eroded. Anyway, the authors of this article, everybody turns around and, so not everybody, a lot of people turn around and say, that's a terrible thing you say, you can't do that. Shrug their shoulders, just a thought experiment. But the thing is, these things are meaningful to the people who want to do things like that. It gives them the basis on which to go forward. And there are huge links between the past and the present. And there's a shield of crypto-eugenics. I don't imagine that somebody who's in the Adelphi Genetics Forum today is a nasty eugenicist. I don't imagine that. Okay? As I said, I don't think you have to be. But the fact of the matter is, they're still looking at the same things, and there are going to be people who will push the envelope. I don't think anybody in the Adelphi Genetics Forum sort of says, I was going to say this in public, but hey, crypto-eugenics, mum's the word. I don't think they follow that policy because it was a policy and they're adhering to it. I think that policy reflects is that they learned that in a post-war society where the poor and working class people are actually looking at the internet or reading newspapers and have their political party, if you go around calling them open mouth breathers and stuff, you're not going to do very well. And so what they've done is they've changed the language completely. Now, it's very easy for somebody to say, oh, these terrible pale, male and stale people in the past, they said these terrible things. We're not like that now. Well, no, you're not like that now. But what they do now is they have this innocuous medical language. And so the example I use in the book is they have a screening test for Down syndrome, and it's called the Nuchal translucency test. And then they can indicate. And as a result, the number of Down syndrome children being born has gone right down. And if you look at this group, I don't think it's an inherited condition. And it's a group, some of the reportedly the most happy people in the world. I can understand that for parents it might be challenging, but I have spoken to people who are familiar with Down syndrome, they have them in their family, and they dearly love them, and they say that they really brighten everybody up. But just on the basis of they're different, they're being eradicated. And it's really important that the past and the present are there, because we might go around today saying, oh, well, we're good, virtuous, justified people. Isn't that nice? But ask yourself, are we? And without rambling too much, have you ever heard of a person whose name is HEK293?
No.
HEK293 is a Dutch girl. But some people say, oh, Mark, don't be ridiculous. She wasn't a Dutch girl. She was a fetus, clump of cells and all of that. So, okay, have it your way. So I'll call it a fetus, you'll call it a Dutch clump of cells, whatever like that. Okay, let's agree to differ on that one. And HEK stands for human embryo kidney. And what they want to do is they want to get the stem cells from the kidney, because these are really good and you can culture them in the laboratory, get them to grow and everything like that. 293 indicates that there were 292 prior to this one. 293 worked. Well, why did it work? What they were trying to do was trying to get these cells. And when you terminate that life, you have the embryo, clump of cells. And what you have to do is you have to go in with a scalpel or implement and get those cells out really, really quickly. If you were to anesthetize that clump of cells or that fetus, or if it was to die, those kidney cells wouldn't be useful at all. So if you look at the implications of that, and it can't be proven because the report on how these cells were obtained went missing. And the fact of the matter is, it is likely that your clump of cells or your fetus was alive at that point in that small life when they took those cells. So medical progress and stuff like that. And I think the fellow who did it, he got awards for it. I don't think I'd have been quite as kind in the treatment if justice applied. I don't believe. Whether you agree with abortion or not, the people or the clump of cells should be treated with dignity. I think we could all agree on that. I'd hope so. And so it's just appalling. But the past and the present, I think now we live in this, oh, well, the Nazis were in the past, all these pale men. It's nonsense. These things are being done in our name. And sorry, at real risk of rambling, have you heard of David Daleiden?
No, neither.
I'd strongly suggest you get him on your podcast, actually, because David Daleiden, he 5-7 years ago went underground at Planned Parenthood. And he posed as being a biotechnician. And so he said, look, I'm in a I can't remember the name of the term, but basically people who use human cells and do biological experiments to create new treatments and stuff. So he goes to Planned Parenthood, takes them out to lunch, goes to their conferences, always makes sure they're in public so he can film them. And what he revealed was just quite shocking and appalling, by which he can actually go there, and there's the most remarkable scene by which he's taken senior person out from Planned Parenthood to lunch, and he's saying, well, I want a brain and I want a heart and I want, so how much are you going to charge me for this? Now, as you probably know, the first rule of negotiation is you don't name your price, because that anchors. So you want to find out how much you've got. How much is your budget? And so this lady says to him, I'm the one who wants to be driving the Lamborghini. No, I may have been wrong. It might have been a Ferrari, but it was certainly a branded car like that. And it's like, hang on, you're talking about human body parts. The public image of Planned Parenthood is we're doing this to help in women, difficult situations, etc., etc., etc. that decision might become rather muddied if it becomes a money-making exercise. And anyway, David Daleiden exposed the invoices they're putting for various body parts that they sell, and as admitted by this senior officer in Planned Parenthood on the videotape, she very tastefully, a nice wine glass, this nice restaurant in California, I think, nice wine glass, bit of a buzz, can I tell you about today's specials, sir? All of that. And she takes time out from eating her salad to get the knife and the fork to show how she would actually perform the abortion to make sure that the body part that he wants is not going to be damaged. And I shouldn't laugh, but with this stuff, it's so batshit crazy that, the alternative is to cry or whatever like that. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. It's absolutely nuts. Yeah. David Daleiden got arrested for that. Kamala Harris was the Attorney General at the time. He was raided by the police, absolutely shut down. That's probably why you haven't heard of it.
Actually, I think I did see that video now, so I wasn't familiar, but I just looked it up as you're talking, David Daleiden, and he worked with Live Action, I think, do good work. And yeah, I recall, I did see that video now. I actually recall, as you visualize that dinner with the wine. And I just would add, what was important for me as you were talking about this crypto eugenics, and I've heard one person say this, I can't recall who years ago, but I think we need to explore this further and popularize it. I actually think climate change is eugenics rebranded. I actually think that's what it is. On top of some of the other narratives and movements that were being sold, because it happens right around that time, 60s. People like William Engdahl and others talk about the Rockefeller Foundation and others coming in the 40s and 50s. You're getting these new foundations and this focus on the green environmental movement. And what are their policies all about today? Not having children, not even having pets, just lowering your consumption. Is total population controlled climate change. They want us rationed, again, take away our mobility, basically put us back into poverty and make us like these, like a slave class, essentially. And so I think climate change, and I think if more and more people fight back and say, no, we're not going, and it's in every city where, here in Mexico, wherever you are, the government's promoting these, they got this branding of the green leaves and it's this for the earth, and like, no, this is eugenics rebranded. Just any thought on that? And yeah.
You're absolutely right. It is. It's just done with acceptable language in the front, and that's why I think the real relevance of the book is that the language that the eugenicists talk about themselves in the book. No one was reading their journal. They thought it wasn't available online. You couldn't go to a place like archive.org to read what they were doing. It was very, very much contained. And what they've then done is they've gone, crikey, we're going to have to continue this agenda, but we're going to have to make it a lot nicer and rebrand it. And every single time, I'll use Joe Atwill's term, they're always promising us the workers' paradise. And so if they're talking about genetic research, it's always to cure somebody which has this terrible genetic disease. And you think, oh, that's wonderful, must allow this progress. But behind the scenes, I think they're actually doing, I think it's called telegenesis or eutelogenesis. It's basically the artificial creation of embryos outside the human body. And they're doing it with sheep, and they're creating these artificial wombs and amniotic sac and all the things to actually grow. And they will, or certain people will be pushing from the thing, that sex will become recreation, if it isn't already. No. Sex will become a recreation. But if you really want to get it right, what we're going to do is we're going to take it seriously, the breeding, and do it that way. And actually that's happening to an extent because you have companies online now by which they promise to do genetic screening. And so you go to them and you'll do IVF and you'll create a whole load of viable embryos. And I think that they're promising that we can screen the ones they're going to be highest IQ, best looking, etc., and the other ones are going to be shunted off. And, you might say, well, it's only a clump of cells and stuff like that. Well, that may be, but it's to achieve that agenda, the very, very much elitist thing of the unfit, the ugly, the poor, they don't have a place on the planet. And it's utterly disgusting the way these people appoint themselves to decide who's going to live and who's not going to live. So yeah, it's not good.
That just made me think of one of my universal principles where I like everything organic, authentic. When I play board games, cheating is not fun. Like let's when I hear people having books ghost written, for me, that is such a turn off, because it's kind of like, I want this person, if I were to write a book, it's just going to be me. It's like whatever is in me that I can get out on that page, that's me. Or same thing with having children now. It's kind of like, just play the hand that's the organically, whatever's going to come about is going to come about. I don't, because now you're playing God, and I don't like, I just never, I don't like that. Anything else that we've covered a lot? One thing that wasn't in your book that you mentioned, I don't know if you want to bring it up now, the Magdalene laundries.
Yeah, the Magdalene laundries. Well, it relates the story in the sense that Dr. Sutherland's always presented as Roman Catholic doctor, and so sort of dealt out with. But a separate episode in his life was in 1955. He went to Ireland, and by that stage, his autobiographies, he was writing travel books. And so he wrote a book about his visit to Australia, his visit to Finland, and so on and so forth. And in 55, he went to Ireland to write a book about Ireland. And his aim in doing so was to try and create some peace between England and Ireland. And he basically said, well, Scotland, my country, and England have had their differences over the years. Some appalling things have happened, but we need to get on, and I'm going to go and examine Ireland. So a couple of things change about the visit. The first thing that changes is when he gets to Ireland, 55, he says to a Irish priest, he says, can you say mass for my son who was killed in the war? So the priest says, what's his name, and all of these questions, and asks how he died. And my uncle, Vincent Joseph Sutherland, died on his first mission in 1945, March 1945. He was in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. Whereupon the Irish priest goes, not saying mass to him anymore. And so my grandfather took a bit of a dim view of that particular secular, the secular clergy. Okay. Next thing that changed was I had another uncle who survived the war, Uncle Richard Moore Sutherland. And he was a diocesan priest in Westminster in London. And effectively, he would have told my grandfather, or my grandfather would have found out, that they had these things called rescue homes, Catholic missions rescue homes. And if a young lady is pregnant and unmarried, scandal, has to get away from home, come, you can stay with us, and we will make sure that the baby is born. We will look after you. That's what they did. When they looked at the people turning up at those homes, they noticed that half of the places in Britain were taken up by Irish girls. So you have these girls in their late teens, early 20s, who, they haven't been probably to Britain before, and all of a sudden they're turning up on the streets of London, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham to have a child. Like, what the hell's going on? So that was a bit strange. So anyway, Dr. Sutherland, having had a dim view of the Irish secular clergy, he decided he wanted to go and look at the Magdalene laundries. And the Magdalene laundries, well, are you familiar with those institutions?
No, I don't think many people wouldn't be familiar with them.
That they were founded, I think, in the 1600s, 1700s or thereabouts. And they were pretty much, the idea was the church would run them as charities, that unmarried mothers would come in, and that they would, they would work, and the nuns would look after them, and then they could be in their confinement and have the baby and so on and so forth. Well, these things kept going, and they were still going in the 1960s, 1970s, possibly later in Ireland. And then there was a big scandal because it was turned out that some of the girls in these institutions, they were put there by their family, and then nobody would come and sign for them. And so they were there for years and years and years. And so anyway, so there's a lot of smoke, all these girls turning up in England for their confinement. So Dr. Sutherland says, I want to go and see this. And he goes to the mother and baby home at Chewham, which, 10 years ago, it was big in the press when Caroline Corliss found all of these bodies buried in a water tank and various versions of that. And where did they come from? There are assertions that the babies, once they were born, that they would take them immediately away from the mother because they'd get good money selling them to be adopted in the United States. So the mother wasn't offered, do you want to keep this child? And I think there's a couple of films about the Magdalene laundries, Philomena, but basically the girl says, oh, here's my baby. And then, the stern priest saying, no, where's it gone? And then you're going back to this place to work where you're actually, it's called a laundry because you're washing for, various institutions in Ireland, and it's a good money spinning business, and it's pretty much free labor. Anyway, long story, sorry. Dr. Sutherland wants to go there to the Magdalene laundry in Galway. And so he has to go and see Bishop Michael Brown, the Bishop of Galway. And I've got notes of their conversation here. I'll just see if I quickly find it. He basically says, I want to go and see the laundry. And he goes, yeah. So Sutherland, in his book, Irish Journey, published in 1956, he says, my lord, I'd like to see the Magdalene Home laundry. Are you going to write it up? I don't know if it's worth writing about until I've seen it, he says. He says, I am their bishop. I've defended the nuns before. I'm going to do so again. Sutherland then asks him, which isn't very tactful to get his ticket, he says, is there anything to hide? So Brown says, there's nothing to hide. Are the girls paid? No, they're not paid, but they pay to work for their board and so on. So he's told, you can go into the laundry, you can interview the nuns, you can speak to them, you can write about it, but the document must be censored. And so no one knew what the document found. And when I tripped over the suitcase in my mother's cellar in 2013, I found in there the uncensored manuscript with the writing of the Mother Superior of the convent. And that caused a bit of a splash at the time in Ireland. I contacted Anne Ferris, TD being the Irish designation for a member of Parliament. And she spoke about it in Parliament and about her experiences with the Magdalene laundries in those times. And so a couple of things. Dr. Sutherland, branded as Roman Catholic doctor, actually spoke truth to power. He didn't give a stuff. And if he thought somebody was doing the wrong thing, Catholic or not, I'm going to speak about it. His book was very badly received in Ireland. And he said how one nun said, this book needs to be, this book is terrible and it should be burnt by the public hangman or something. So, but he said, in case anybody missed the point, here is, in the American edition, he said, the Irish clergy have too much power, they have lost touch with their people, and they are too fond of their money. He said, if Ireland becomes communist in the next 10 years, they will be largely to blame, he believed. Now, I should say the monastic clergy, etc., aren't in on that, okay? But he was very much speaking truth to power. Now, I have been contacted twice by the BBC about this story. And one, quick, hurry up, I want to find out this. And I told them the story about my uncle who was a priest. No one's ever known that before. It's family law, okay? Does it get included in the story? No. She just used the material, the censored material from the 1950s. Does she use the uncensored material I quote about? No, because what Dr. Sutherland wrote about was how a girl tried to escape from the second floor, climbed on a drain plate, falls down, breaks her hip. And the nun goes, she won't be trying that again. He writes about how a girl threw a shoe into a washing machine, and it cost a lot of money to repair. They had to bring somebody to Galway from London, and so she was beaten. And so there's evidence of the treatment of these girls. And then the real clincher was, the bit that was censored, was some of these girls were on parole. So they'd been convicted of some offense, and then they'd go into the Magdalene laundry when they're in the custody of the priest, and then they'd be passed over. And the significance, I was told by Irish historians and by Anne Ferris, was that this shows Catholic Ireland, where you have the state and you have the Catholic Church hand in hand to administer these girls. Those girls on parole should never, they might temporarily have been given to nuns for safekeeping, but never there for years and years and years. They had the inquiry, I'm not sure, was it the Backlease inquiry? I get muddled up with the names. The document was available. I published it online. I hadn't been contacted by anybody in the Irish state, anybody to do with the inquiry, to find out what the document said. If you go to hallidaysutherland.com, you can actually look at the uncensored document. So it basically came to nothing. But I believe, and of course I'm probably subjective here, I believe that they don't want to promote that story because, you know what, they really like Roman Catholic doctor. Because Roman Catholic doctor is a boo, his villain, we can all throw, eggs at. Also, it means Roman Catholic doctor, we don't have to mention that our heroine, Marie Stopes, was a eugenicist, and we don't have to mention the really nasty stuff behind her agenda. And I think most of all, what they can do is they can stick to this triumphalist story of when people go into the shop to buy contraceptives or use it, and that's up to them. I'm not, trying to impose on them. But if they do that, they should know the foundation story. And it wasn't freedom for you, we really care about it. No, it's you are horrid and we do not want your horrid kids on this planet. We realize that if we kill them, we're going to be up for charges. And so let's do it when it's less noticeable. And that triumphal story should be known, particularly, it's going on today. They put a lot of effort into putting these triumphal stories in our head, so we accept them.
Hey, like I said earlier, they almost got me as an undergrad student, but I was able to escape the matrix.
Well,
We've covered a lot. Any final thought? And then if you, all of your links are in the description. And so, where would be the best places for people?
I've got the world's most feeble Substack articles. Most Substack site. So Mark Halliday Sutherland on Substack, and I say it's feeble because it's like I was going to write an article one a week or whatever. Well, there are a few articles there. Have a look at that. Or if you go to the website hallidaysutherland.com, I occasionally update that and write articles, and you can get in touch with me there. I'd urge people to have a look at the book. If you have a Kindle, you don't have to buy the book. You can download the preview, and it gives you the first chunk, which tells you about eugenics. So without paying a cent, you can do that. And my real desire is that that the story is known, to tell people the truth, and to realize that COVID, the jabs, climate change, as the cliche goes, it ain't their first rodeo, and they need to wake up.
All right. Very good. Exterminating Poverty. Again, the book, The True Story of the Eugenic Plan to Get Rid of the Poor, and the Scottish doctor who opposed it. All the links are there. So check it out. And thanks for coming on the podcast, Mark.
Hilve, thank you so much. Love your work and really privileged to be on your podcast. Thank you very much.